Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. So grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday, February 27th. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us on this evening. If you're listening to us live or if you are downloading this as a podcast, we're so grateful that you're taking this time to be and to share with us. You know, my name is Father Nicholas Lowe. I'm the parish priest at St. John the Divine, and I'm joined by my lovely wife and co-host, Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
Good evening, everyone.
And for years now, we've had this show called Live with the Louhs that marries both faith and psychology to kind of give you some guiding principles to live by in your own walk of faith. And so if you're new to the show, welcome. And if you've been part of our show for many, many years, we're so grateful that you continue to listen to us. Before we dive into tonight's really cool and important topic, I do want to encourage you, as we do every single week, that, you know, we're on so many different social media platforms. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. You can find us all throughout the week. We post stuff all the time. You can find us on those platforms by simply Googling the Louhs or putting actually in their search engine the Louhs, and that last name is spelled Louhs. That's Louhs. And also, if you're interested in listening to all of our sermons, you know, we've archived all of our sermons. You can find them on our YouTube channel. We'd actually love it if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel, and that too is also the Louhs as well. And I'm not too sure if you're familiar with all the algorithms that a lot of the social media platforms do, but the more interest allows our videos to go higher up in the search, so that when people may be inquiring about the Orthodox Church or inquiring about a sermon or a topic, much like what we're talking about tonight, that really impacts all people, this allows that much more accessibility to that. So definitely, if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do it right now. We'd love to have you do that. And as many of you may know, Roxanne and I published our newest book. We're really excited about this book. It's called 6 Hours, 7 Lessons. And the book is going to be coming out the week of Lent. And it's just exciting. I know, Roxanne, we're happy to be sharing this with everyone. It's called 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness. And basically, friends, what we do is, much like in Renewing You, we took 8 of the biggest topics that Roxanne and I see as a priest and psychologist and kind of address them from both a faith and psychology perspective. Here we're taking the 7 statements, these are the 7 recorded statements that Christ shares while he's on the cross. And these final 6 hours, as the Bible shares, of him being on the cross, he makes his 7 extraordinary life principles. In his darkest of day, he's sharing and thinking about us. And so we dedicate this book to just the different topics that he does. And so if you're looking for topics on forgiveness, if you're looking for topics about, you know, how do we get our minds straight? For many of us, our minds are just constantly racing. If you're looking for just what it means to have people that are partnering up with you and to care for you, definitely encourage you to check out our new book. Again, it comes out on March 19th. You can pre-order it right now by going to our website at thelouhs.com. In fact, Roxanne and I will actually send you the book. You can, and it will be autographed by us. So just as an FYI, and our website is thelouhs.com. And finally, as I share with you all the time, our daily inspirational messages are sent out every single day at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. If you haven't downloaded those and receiving those, again, you can find them at our website. Simply go to thelouhs.com/subscribe. And all you have to do is simply put in your email address, and that's all it is right there. So again, as we do every week, you can call us. We'd love to hear from you, especially on tonight's topic. We're talking a great deal about one of the most difficult topics to talk about, and that is of trauma. And so before I share with you a little bit about this topic and why we're talking about it tonight, I do invite you to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us a question or a comment during the show. And again, as you know from previous shows, if you don't feel comfortable sharing your name, we've already got some emails of people that do not want to share their names, that we totally will understand that and respect that. Or if you want to call us to remain anonymous, our producer will make sure that that happens. So let's get started, friends. You know, friends, life can be predictably unpredictable. For one moment, things could be going great in our life, and the next moment, things could be so difficult. Today, I was doing a funeral service for a young woman that passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind 2 children and a husband who's just so distraught. It's unpredictable. And so often when those moments happen in our life, we can feel like the weight of the world is crashing down on our hearts. We feel what many call trauma. What is exactly trauma? How does it impact us emotionally, physically, spiritually? How does it impact even our relationships with other people? Well, here to talk to us about that tonight is such a dear friend of our show, someone that we respect greatly. Her name is Sangeetha Thomas, and she's a licensed professional counselor in private practice and is also the director of mental health ministries for the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the United States of America. She's also, as director, she collaborates with an interdisciplinary team of experts in mental health, ministry, and theology to create programs and resources that support the mental health needs of Orthodox Christians across the United States. As a psychotherapist, Sangeetha works with adults in diverse backgrounds who are healing from trauma, exploring multicultural identity and intergenerational trauma as children of immigrants, or learning to integrate their faith identity. We're so excited to have her on the show. So Sangeetha, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us on Live with the Louhs.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to explore such a heavy and deep topic in a safe space, and I'm just happy to be serving our community in this way. So thank you for opening this space to discuss this.
Absolutely. Well, let's kind of talk just initially. Let's talk about trauma. Terms like trauma and PTSD are being used more frequently in today's society and media. We hear this on the news. We hear it sometimes even in our own experiences with friends, and maybe even in our own lives as people hear this show tonight. How do we accurately define trauma and understand truly what it means?
Yeah, I think this is the ideal place to start, just because social media, TikTok, all these things, we do use clinical terms, sometimes very loosely, sometimes out of context, and they can get used in a way where it can create a lot of misunderstanding, and to the point where the word itself loses some of its meaning at times, where people don't take it seriously anymore. And I don't want that to happen. So for the sake of this show, I'd like to just work with the definition that trauma is a psychological and physiological response to events or experiences that exceeds an individual person's ability to cope. So the key words there would be response, that this is the body's response to something. It's not the event itself. It's the response to the event that creates a traumatic experience internally. The other word is exceed and an individual's ability to cope. So to an extent, trauma is subjective. It's not always the event itself that the person is going through, but it is the individual person's threshold that is being exceeded that can result in trauma or trauma response. So for example, PTSD is the more extreme side of this. This is the diagnosable disorder of chronic flashbacks and more intense symptoms of trauma. Not every soldier who returns from a tour in Afghanistan or Iraq comes back with PTSD. Some of them do. Not every person who goes through a car accident or any kind of community violence develops PTSD. Some of them do. And so we do have to really see that PTSD is one category at the extreme end of a traumatic response, but it's not that every single person who goes through what is a traumatic event necessarily develops the disorder. And it's, when we say it's subjective, that doesn't mean that there's not some things that can be universally accepted. For example, war. War is something, and community violence, shootings, and things like that are things that are so extraordinary to what is our normal experience of the world that most people would agree that's a traumatic experience. And I think that's the gray area where sometimes we just say, that's traumatic, this is trauma, I have trauma. And we start using things really loosely because we blur those lines between what are universally accepted as extraordinary events and the clinical definition, which is trauma is what's happening within the individual person when their unique ability to cope is exceeded.
Sangeetha, maybe we could kind of dive into that a little bit more, because I know that's always a question, people have, why do some, following, for instance, 9/11, there are people who have a lot of post-traumatic stress as a result of that, and other people who came out okay, who were in the building. And, I've heard, various, theories on that. Some people say baseline levels of mental health, baseline levels of, happiness, sort of were correlated with resiliency. What would you say, the research is saying around what mediates the difference between people who experience something and seem to come out, more resilient versus those, who seem to kind of end up, with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah. And it's hard to predict. I mean, it is something that we can see in the research where there's a combination of sometimes genetics, and sometimes it's the extent of protective factors that a person has. So when we say protective factors, it's, do you have a community? Do you have a sense of meaning and purpose beyond yourself? Do you have people who can support you through this thing? Do you have people rallying behind you? And then when we say genetics, we're also talking about your unique history. Did your family also go through these things? And we'll come back to that. That's a bigger concept, but every single person, if you can imagine this window, there's a lower threshold and a higher threshold. And if you can imagine, every single person has a unique window of what they can handle. And we all go through stressful events. When someone cuts you off on the highway, you have a stress response. Your body is designed by God to survive these scary things, not because God wants us to, but he wants us to endure. And so our body will have this knee-jerk unconscious response of adrenaline and cortisol. And that stress will peak and then it will cycle back down again. And completing that cycle is normal and healthy. It's not about not ever having stress. But for one person, genetically, they may have grown up either in a really difficult household where their cortisol threshold, their stress threshold is a much smaller window. It's a tighter space to work with. And so for them, when they experience something like trauma, an extraordinary event that exceeds their ability to cope, they might get stuck in that. And that might be post-traumatic stress disorder for them, a prolonged experience of intense emotion. We can't always predict it apples to apples, but we can say that there are things that contribute to it, like family history and genetics and coping skills and protective factors in an individual's person's life, that two people can go through the same thing and end up on two different sides of that spectrum.
You're listening to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us this evening. We're speaking with Sangeetha Thomas, who is a licensed professional counselor. We're talking a great deal tonight about trauma, and maybe some of you that are listening to our show this evening, or maybe via podcast, are going through that. We hope that this show is beneficial. But if you're listening to us live and you maybe are going through a difficult time right now, or know someone that is, and you'd like some guidance or some counsel on that, feel free to give us a call at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us a question during the live broadcast of our show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. I just kind of wanted to add to what Roxanne was sharing with you is and just as a general question for me is, does prolonged trauma then ultimately lead to PTSD? Would that be correct in saying?
It can. I think, we have to delineate between acute trauma, which is a single event or several single events, and then complex trauma, which can happen over a long period of time. So when I work with clients who have experienced abuse, whether that's sexual abuse or family violence or other things in their home, to say that it's prolonged, I mean, they may not have PTSD, but they may have traumatic patterns in a narrative that has been developed that has now negatively impacted their core identity. So, for example, as an individual therapist working with adults, a lot of times I have clients who experience prolonged childhood experiences of trauma, meaning an abusive parent in many cases, physically abusive, verbally abusive, emotionally abusive parent. That adult, I have some clients who don't have PTSD. I have some who do. But all of them have post-traumatic stress. we all can experience post-traumatic stress. You know, if you would go through I experienced a car accident where, like, for about 3 months after that car accident, every time someone pulled up real close behind my car because I had gotten rear-ended, I felt a little bit of my body tense up. That's post-traumatic stress. But that's not necessarily a full-blown disorder because it's not the intense emotional flashbacks. And,
right.
So we do have to kind of draw those lines there.
And do you find that, you know, as Frankl would talk about the people in the concentration camps, you know, finding meaning and purpose is sort of helping them get through? I mean, where do you see our faith and a sense of, you know, meaning and purpose fitting into this sort of greater, you know, puzzle of trauma?
Absolutely. And it can go two ways, right? If faith can be such a protective factor. It can be a place where we find meaning that exceeds and transcends any suffering that we're going through. Frankl in his book talks about it, Man's Search for Meaning. Father Arseny talks about it in experiencing the Bolshevik gulags, right? Like we see those stories. Nelson Mandela even talks about things like this. So people who go through incredibly difficult things, when they find meaning, can find a way to not just have a physiological survival response or a psychological way of coping with stress, but instead can access a space where they can hold the distress and see that it's not going to break them at the same time. Now, I don't want anyone who's listening to see that if they experience trauma or if they experience PTSD, that it's a failure of faith, because that's not quite the case.
That's so good to hear.
Absolutely. And, you know, I also do EMDR, and EMDR is a very specific trauma treatment protocol. And in that protocol, the way we approach trauma is just as a very neutral definition, which I love, is just seeing trauma as a memory encoding issue. When we go through a traumatic experience, the brain is actively receiving that information of what is happening in this experience and also processing the emotions of that experience. So when those experiences and all that information gets coded into memory, it should go into a state of, this happened in the past, I am not going through this anymore. That happened. In the case of trauma, instead of it shifting into a past tense resting state, it stays static. It's almost like you have this live wire or a switch that stays on that should be going off. Or like when you have a faulty old car and the horn is just blaring and you're not pressing the button, but it's just going because the wires are crossed. That's what it feels like. It feels like something is alarming, even though it should be settled. And that's not because you didn't pray hard enough. It's not because you don't have a faith that can transcend, like Father Arseny or like Viktor Frankl. It's not about that. It's that your faith can be a tool that helps you to overcome that with the conjunction of psychotherapy and EMDR and treatment and support and a community.
Let me ask you, just as out of curiosity, and, how do you know if you are do have PTSD or suffering from trauma? I mean, because I think some people just kind of live through it, and unless they're really having someone that is either a therapist or someone that's speaking in their life about it, I mean, do you find that a lot, that people may not even acknowledge what they are even struggling with? And if so, what would it look like for, in very generic terms, for someone that is struggling with that?
Absolutely. I think this is where my work in intergenerational trauma and developmental trauma, that's where it really comes up. That pattern of people don't realize they are acting out of a trauma response or trauma pattern. Now, if you go through something that is particularly difficult, like an extraordinary event, like we mentioned previously, most people are able to recognize that that is trauma. Or, if it just takes that one question of, how distressed do you feel on a 1 through 10 scale or a 0 through 10 scale? And you realize, oh, I'm not at a 0. Anything but a 0 is, oh, okay, I'm still kind of living through that a little bit. That still feels really tense. Now, with developmental trauma, what happens is, now developmental trauma refers to adverse experiences in childhood where a child interprets something with their caregiver or in another adult as a traumatic event or something in their society or community. And those things, because a child is resilient in trying to survive and also experiencing something where they have to survive at all instead of being secure and safe, they can interpret something, and that creates this narrative that they don't realize is now painting every human interaction that they have, how they view themselves, how they view their worth, and especially adult interactions. So as a therapist working with adults, sometimes I have 20, 30, 40-year-old people who are dealing with and still processing a narrative that was created of, I'm not good enough. I have to be perfect. There's no space for mistakes. I can't let my parent down. That's just a brief statement. If we take it out of context, it almost sounds silly, but when we put it into the context of what a person is going through, it makes a lot of sense why talking to a parent where that stems from can re-trigger all kinds of emotions. And it cuts real deep when it hits something like I'm worthless or I'm the problem. It changes how you view your whole self, your identity, and can seep into your spiritual life from there.
And so maybe we could sort of touch on some of those adaptive versus not so adaptive, strategies for trying to cope, so that people listening may kind of take a deeper look when they notice themselves, oh, gee, maybe that does come from somewhere else that I do that. I've had a lot of people, for instance, who, can talk about things without feeling those things. For instance, they can talk about something that I'm reacting to because it sounds so, horrific, and they have no emotion because they've experienced a life where there was no room to, have emotional experiences in relation to what they felt. They just kind of had to survive. And so something even as basic as, separating emotion from experience, a disconnected experience can sort of be a maladaptive, coping strategy that somebody's developed in order to survive. But maybe you could kind of talk a little bit about, things that you've seen that are a little bit more adaptive versus some of those things that maybe we should, if we notice we're doing, could maybe take a deeper look at some of those coping strategies that we've taken on.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and it's a red flag that I look for in clients to see how aware are they, how self-aware are they, and what's the baseline I'm working with as a therapist is kind of the dialogue that's happening in my head when I have a client who's telling me about something is, do they have an emotional reaction to what they're going through, or are they just giving me autobiographical information? And so I think that is something that even if you're not a therapist, it kind of doesn't sit right with you, and if there's someone in your life who's sharing something that's so heavy, and sometimes teenagers do this, they joke about something that's incredibly heavy, and it's their way of coping. They use humor, sarcasm, cynicism as a way to just share. So sharing and connection, community, those are beautiful adaptive coping mechanisms. Going for a walk, exercising, that's wonderful. Now, maladaptive means that you're hurting yourself as you try to help yourself. So things like substance use, sexually acting out sometimes, and there's all kinds of abuse of the body, sometimes with disordered eating, and it's things where sometimes I see on a spiritual sense the maladaptive coping of there's so much shame that it keeps somebody from going to confession and talking to their spiritual father. And that's something that, like, it's so rewarding to work as a therapist with Orthodox clients who we can work through that, and we can talk through the shame. We can talk through the fact that you have carried this deep down in your heart for 10 years, 20 years. And something has kept you from bringing it to the light. Something has kept you from sharing it with someone. One big maladaptive coping mechanism is emotional suppression. And I think that's where, for any of the listeners, if you want to think through generational trauma, the great way to think about it is, how did your parents in the home that you grew up in, how did they express emotions? Particularly things like fear, sadness, stress. Did they have nuance? Did they have colors to it? Or did it all just come out as anger? How did we talk about money? Did we talk about money, or did we tiptoe around it? Did we talk about sex, or did we tiptoe around it? How was shame addressed? How were mistakes addressed? In some families, those things are addressed in a really healthy, compassionate way. That's not the case for every family. That's not the case for every generation of a family. And what we see in the family research is that every individual has at least 3 generations worth of behavioral patterns that they are carrying into their life. So you and I are carrying at least 3 generations worth of, to say it bluntly, emotional baggage. Which, using myself as an example, I'm a first generation Indian American. My parents immigrated here in their 20s right after they got married. So immigration is a traumatic experience. They left their family behind to a country that they barely know anybody, in the middle of Dallas, Texas, from South India, that's all the way across the world. That's a traumatic experience. And that probably put them into stress and survival modes that I will never fully understand in order to give me a better life. Right. My grandparents went through the transition from British imperialism in India to Indian independence, which was relatively recent. So that brought up all kinds of things, I'm sure, in their parenting style that got passed to my parents' parenting style and emotional expression, because every family and every household is the social and emotional learning school. It's the classroom where we learn the basic skills of how do we deal with that stress window? How do we cope with things that happen outside of our ability to cope? Do we lash out at our kids? Do we beat them? Do we kick the dog? All of those things come up in the family first.
Absolutely.
You're listening to Live with the Louhs, and again, we are so excited to have our dear friend Sajitha Thomas, who's a licensed professional counselor here, and just an amazing therapist. She serves as the director of mental health ministries for the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops right here in the United States. And we're so excited to have her talk to us tonight about how all of us can experience trauma, and really, what is trauma? How do we deal with it? How do we process it? And we'd love to hear from you. If you've got a question, comment, I know there's been some emails already sent out. We'll get to those definitely shortly. But if you have a comment that you'd like to call us, or you're struggling with some trauma right now, or know someone that is, feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or feel free to email us during the live broadcast of our show by emailing us at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. I couldn't help but think to myself, how beautifully you stated earlier that in many ways we're kind of like a sum total of all of our relationships, and experiences that we've had throughout our life and experiences that we've had in childhood. And sometimes watching how our parents dealt with trauma or dealt with struggle in their own life, in many ways, sometimes we can adopt those same habits and those same behavior. How significant is it when we look at, generational trauma? How significant does that play a role in who we are and how we process trauma in our own lives? Because, and the reason why I'm asking this question, Sanjita, is just when I look at what's going on around the world right now, you don't need to be on the news for that long to see just the sheer terror that's taking place. And for so many of us, when we watch the news or watch what's going on in the world, and really even in our own lives, we tend to only kind of categorize things based upon the number of deaths that have happened or the number of killings that have taken place, but we don't really talk too much about the emotional scars that happen and how that impacts not only this generation. So I'm thinking of the people that are in the Gaza Strip or in Israel or in Ukraine and in Russia. I mean, the long-term impacts that the children and the family members that are there, how that will continue on for not just what's going on the here and now, but in the future. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful point that you make, that we measure things by death. as opposed to the ripple effect that it has on an entire globe, entire community, a human race. And there's so much there. And one layer is all of us here in the privileged Western world watching it on the news. That's one layer deep. And I would say that, what we see with children specifically is observing violence is just as harmful as experiencing it directly. So we see that particularly in the research with children who experience family violence, where the parent is not abusing the child, but the parent is abusing the spouse. So when we see this type of news constantly, the negative media, whether it's the actual war or if it is media taking a particularly negative spin and only reporting negative, scary, stressful things happening in our world, we as adults can also feel our mind is already having a stress response to simply what we are seeing and hearing. So that's one level deep that we're already experiencing. Now, if we go all the way to Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, and everywhere else in the world that's experiencing these hardships, then we see on a deeper individual level, not just the children who are experiencing war and the fear for their lives and not knowing if they're going to make it, and seeing their neighbors, their loved ones, their family members dying in front of them or violently brutalized in front of them. Just witnessing it is already one layer, but to experience it and feel that fear for your life constantly puts the body in such a heightened stress response that none of us are meant to stay in. That stress response that I mentioned earlier that happens in that window, that stress cycle that earlier I said is God designed to help us survive. If a snake crosses your path or a scorpion is in your shoe, right? Like, you've got to jump back. But we're meant to complete that cycle. We're not meant to stay there and get stuck there, because that's not sustainable. That cortisol, the stress hormone that's released, actually does damage to your body when it stays there. It's not meant to stay there. It's meant to be the jet fuel that gets you to safety. But you can't run on jet fuel. It'll burn you up from the inside out. And we see, so many people, women especially, who suppress emotions. And this is separating from the immediate example of war, but women especially who suppress emotions, men who suppress emotions, experience all matter of immune disorders, physiological disorders, unexplained chronic pain, things that get put under the umbrella of fibromyalgia, because it's unresolved trauma that gets trapped in the body. That live wire that I mentioned earlier that is just pumping out cortisol is burning you up from the inside. And what we see, if we keep going with the war example, these children who are, if they survive, God willing, if they survive, they have children, what we see is that the concept of epigenetics, which is that gene expression from one generation to the next changes. So I think sometimes we don't remember from our biology class that our genes are not always light switches, that, you either have blue eyes or you have green eyes, or you have black hair or you have blonde hair. We have some genes that are on a dimmer switch, and they can be expressed more or they can be expressed less. And so epigenetics is the study of how some genes can be expressed more or expressed less based on what you're exposed to. So pregnant mothers who experience anxiety or trauma, I think we all saw the news of when Putin bombed a pregnancy ward in Ukraine. Pregnant mothers who experience that pumping of cortisol, that child in utero is also receiving that cortisol, and that can affect their gene expression. That can affect that window that I had mentioned earlier. If it's going to be more narrow, if their baseline cortisol is going to be higher in the next generation, and then the generation thereafter, that's it. We're changing our DNA. We're changing not just how we view who we are as people on the psychological sense, but physiologically, right down to our genes.
Wow, I that's such powerful information. I think for all of us to hear that the impact of what we see going on in this world, individually, within our country, within the world, the long-term impacts that we are changing our genealogy. I mean, that's just so powerful. We're going to take a quick break right now, friends, and then on the other side of this break, we're going to talk more with Sangeetha Thomas about trauma and how it impacts us and how it even can impact even in our churches. So definitely stay with us. We'll be right back with you.
Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio. They would love to hear from you.
Travel alongside our pilgrim in this whimsically illustrated retelling of the Russian classic in The Little Way of a Pilgrim by Jennifer Anna Rich. Here is a serious adventure poised to embed the love of the Jesus prayer in the hearts of children and their bedtime readers alike. As he sets his curious feet forward, our pilgrim is tenacious in his quest for prayer. His winding path leads him to a deep love for all creation, offers tools to overcome anxious thoughts, and reveals surprisingly simple ways of experiencing the joy of being with God. The Little Way of a Pilgrim by Jennifer Anna Rich. Available now at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF Radio. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. So grateful that you're joining us on this Tuesday evening. Tonight, we're talking about trauma and how it impacts all of us. But before I do, I just want to remind all of you that we would love to hear from you. We are available if you are would like to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And before I go any further, I do want to remind all of you about our daily inspirational messages. You can find them by going to our website right now and register for them at thelouhs.com. That's LOUHS.com. And it'll also share with you about our brand new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, coming out on Tuesday, March 19th. Sangeetha, we just had this question that came in that I thought was just... that was an email question I thought that was so appropriate for us to ask right now. It says this: my parents always responded in very volatile ways. Mistakes were never okay. Perfection was always expected. I find myself not having patience for mistakes by others now, and I have become volatile in the same way my parents responded. I'm embarrassed by my responses, but I don't have control over them. How do I unlearn this terrible behavior? How do I learn to control my impatience? What would you tell this person?
That's a great question, and something that I hear very, very often with clients. And that I bet. Want to just to acknowledge the courage to share that, despite the embarrassment that the person shared. It's tough. Unlearning that when you were immersed in that is like trying to teach a fish what water is, like you're just so immersed in it, you don't realize it until you're on the other side, until you're out of that family system. And that's something that can be overcome. And I would start with the idea of compassion and the idea of pausing and noticing yourself. And I know a lot of times there's folks who will say, well, you have to forgive your parents, you have to move on. There's this this Hollywood image of what psychotherapy is, that we're all just sitting around blaming our parents. And that's not really the case. I think it starts with the compassion that we're able to receive, that's being given to us by Christ. And so when people have this experience of volatility from parent to child, you internalize that. The projection that this person is talking about on the other people in their lives, not having patience with other folks, is really just your inability to hold it within yourself. There's a shame there. There is some kind of a lack of compassion for myself in making mistakes. that mistakes are so unacceptable that I have to be perfect. And that gets thrown out as blame to other people. But if you can sit with, can I make mistakes? Can I be a little less than perfect sometimes? Is there grace for me? Is there compassion being extended to me? When have I made a mistake? And can I sit with that? Can I process that? Can I give myself the compassion that my parents didn't, that I needed them to give? That's what we do in therapy a lot of times, is reparenting. We're unlearning and relearning those processes that we wish that our parents would have taught us. We wish our parents would have responded with compassion and support, not just complacency of like, oh, mistakes don't matter, but to hold us up and to say, I know you can do this. I know that you don't have to be perfect. And also, I know that that you can achieve this if you set your mind to it, to support you enough and also encourage you to reach to whatever goal you set your mind to. And it starts with your relationship with God, because that compassion is being given from God to you. That idea of self-compassion is something that I would suggest that this listener and any other listeners would look into. That's Kristen Neff is somebody who writes on that. The idea of being able to recognize there's this wounded part of you inside that needs to be connected with. And if we don't connect with that, it will get thrown out onto other people as volatility. But if we can sit with that inner part, whether through therapy or through meditation or confession, we can work on that. We can overcome that. We can heal from all of this.
And obviously this writer is talking about, a long-term history with some pretty difficult, family systems. But I think that we deal with a lot of, things that overwhelm us in daily life. Even if we didn't have an abusive parent, we have rush hour traffic, we have infidelity in marriage, we have chronic work abuse, we have bosses that make us feel inferior, we have coaches, belittling, kids. I mean, it's like everywhere you look, there are a sea of intense emotions happening in people in a chronic sense, and they're not necessarily like labeled abuse, and so I'm kind of interested in what your thoughts are on how that kind of trauma or regular, stress, intersects with our spiritual life as Orthodox Christians, and how it affects our identities in Christ, and kind of where our faith fits into that problem, because I think at times it can destroy people's ability to live their faith in those moments. We stop believing who God says we are and the dreams and plans he has for our life, and we start to feel, like we maybe believe those messages. And so I'm kind of curious as to, how we would address, that kind of prolonged emotional distress that a lot of people who have not entered any kind of abusive situation are dealing with, and how that affects their spiritual walk.
And, some of this is that what I mentioned earlier, that the family is the social emotional learning classroom. And so there may not have been outright abuse. Sometimes what I see in families, there's a unhealthy communication patterns, for example, or the lack of clear communication. And it's not necessarily that this explicit abuse was happening, but it is the lack of support and connection when connection was needed by the child. And for that child, they can be learning in an implicit type of way that we don't talk about these things. We bury these things. Mom and dad bury these things. We never talk about anything. And so sometimes I have clients who, when I have them think back on their childhood, they're like, everything was fine. I had a good, happy childhood. They don't remember it as, oh, my parents had an unhealthy communication. My parents never talked about emotions. Isn't that kind of weird that we just buried everything? And so, yeah, there are some cases where we don't realize that an unhealthy way of approaching emotion in the family system can impact us. And on the other side of it, like you said, Dr. Roxanne, that it's not just the family, it's the whole community around us. It's all the news, it's the driving, it's the rush hour, it's the workplace that may be toxic.
Absolutely.
And all of those things can be all these little tick marks that total up at the end of a day. And it just whittles away at a person if they're not able to cope with it, if they're not able to, like I mentioned before, if that stress cycle peaks and then it peaks and then it peaks and then it peaks, it just keeps getting tickered up and it doesn't quite make its way back down. I would like to encourage anybody who's listening to that and resonating with it, which I do too at times, when I have one thing pile on top of another, and it just feels like too much until I hit a breaking point, that we can all work on self-awareness. We can all work on asking for help. I recently saw a video that said that most people only need about 8 minutes of time with a trusted friend. Not a whole gaggle of friends, not a whole posse of people behind you, but 8 minutes with one trusted person to feel empathy and emotional connection and to be able to self-regulate again.
How often was that study reflecting that need for 8 minutes?
I can't recall that, but I would say that it would be safe to say we could use that as needed. There's another study that would say that did some research on deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, where if you can practice deep diaphragmatic breathing, 5 repetitions, repeatedly, 5 times a day, that's 5 sets, 5 times a day, that you can reduce your cortisol level. So that cortisol level that we were earlier talking about gets passed down from generation to generation and can sometimes get elevated in the next generation, can be reduced. And that study was done with caregivers of others. So I will say that that stress, that chronic stress, can absolutely derail us and push us to a breaking point. And also the solutions, the adaptive coping mechanisms of connecting with another person and breathing and pausing and just connecting with God, or just connecting with yourself for a second,
absolutely,
are absolutely accessible.
And I love the noticing that you're talking about, because I think in any given moment, we're less likely to notice ourselves and more likely to notice the world around us. And just that brief sort of shift in awareness to kind of go into ourselves and notice what we feel, what we think, what our urges are. I mean, that's just not something we always study or pay attention to, but kind of helps pinpoint, maybe where we're reacting, why we're reacting, what the themes are. And, that becomes a sort of foundation that we can kind of begin trying to re-regulate ourselves. We did get another email question, and I sort of want to jump into this because that was where we were going to go next, sort of about what's available to help people who are struggling. And the email says, you said that the memory of trauma keeps going off like an alarm with faulty wiring. Is there a way to turn off that alarm? And so with that, I'd love for you to sort of introduce EMDR and what therapy for trauma looks like so that we can turn off that alarm.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And so with EMDR, what we see is there's the rational thinking part of you, and there's the emotional reactive part of you. Now that's an oversimplification of how the brain works, but for the sake of our conversation, we can look at it that way. With clients who are experiencing that faulty wiring, where the memory gets switched into a static mode and it just keeps going off. Alarm bells just keep ringing, can't seem to turn them off. What we see is that they can rationally, cognitively talk through something, but emotionally they are still on. They are still wired as if it's happening. And no amount of talking about it is seeming to settle the emotional side. So what we do in EMDR is, EMDR stands for eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, which is a mouthful that basically means I follow a protocol, or any therapist who does this follows a protocol where we use eye movements, where the therapist would move their hand back and forth to a certain succession. And what this does is it creates bilateral stimulation of the brain on both hemispheres of the brain, and it taxes your attention to the point where, similar to how your cardiologist does a stress test, we tax your brain's attention to the point where you can re-access that faulty wiring. You can re-access by stressing your brain just enough in a safe place, in a grounded place, in a secure place, you can re-access that memory, and we can start to bring it back down again. And we can start to unlearn the negative narrative that was created, which is I'm not good enough, or, I'm a terrible person, or I'm a piece of trash, whatever narrative was created. Mm-hmm. And we can relearn something that is actually much more healthy. That is something that happens through EMDR, specifically for people who feel like they've talked and talked and talked, and they can't seem to just get that switch to turn off. Now, I do have some clients who just love talk therapy, and talk therapy is still effective. Clients who particularly struggle with things like shame, especially my Orthodox Christian clients who are more inclined to want to incorporate their spiritual father and confession and things like that, they like to talk about it. And it's because they've never talked about it with anybody before. And so simply talking about it is part of their healing process. And so EMDR is something that's accessible. Not everyone's a candidate, but it's kind of like taking the highway versus taking the scenic route. We'll both end up in the same place. We'll both lead to healing. EMDR is more intense, and so some folks are not necessarily a candidate, so you have to screen for that. But if you are a candidate, it can be a really, really fast way of taking a level 10, a level 7 on the distress scale and bringing it down to 0. And I've seen that happen, and it's just effective over video. I do it exclusively through telehealth. And every time we bring it down to 0. And it doesn't matter if it's sexual abuse, or if it's abuse from a parent, or if it's something else that they've endured, but whatever number they're on that scale, the goal of EMDR is to bring you down to 0. And that's absolutely possible. One other thing I'll mention is I don't think you have to have an Orthodox EMDR therapist. So if you're experiencing trauma and you're just thinking about, I just need that wire, that alarm to stop going off, you don't have to have an Orthodox Christian therapist. I think I want to encourage anybody who's thinking about, well, maybe I need this, to just get the help where you can get the help. Find what's accessible to you. Now, if you're interested in talk therapy and it aligns really well, like whatever you're going through is very specific to your spiritual life, and you're looking for an Orthodox Christian therapist, the Assembly of Bishops has a directory of Orthodox Christian therapists that you can find by accessing our website. It is assemblyofbishops.org/mental health, and you'll see all the mental health resources there. The directory is at the top of the page, and you can just punch in your state and find an Orthodox Christian mental health provider who might be able to support you through what you're looking for.
So, Githa, we just have a few minutes. We've probably got about 7 minutes left of our show. I did want to ask, I think it's so important as people of faith, as Christians, to remind that we live in community, that when one of us, the Bible talks about this from cover to cover, about the need for us to care for one another, to carry each other's burdens, to be there for one another. We hear that beautifully when the story of the paralytic, when Christ sees the faith of the friends, it acts as a catalyst to him healing the paralytic. How important is it for us to create communities, to create places of where it is safe for us to share what our trauma is going, what we may be going through, and help to cultivate that within our communities? What are some ways that we could practically do today to do that?
Absolutely. So this is huge. And this is something that actually, if you're interested in the research, you can look at factors that contribute to longevity, specifically women versus men. And something that absolutely contributes is having a positive community, having a community that you can share your hardships with and experience that empathy and connection and feel that you can get through what you're going through. So practically speaking, the idea behind the Assembly of Bishops creating Peace of Mind, which is our training in mental health first aid and Orthodox bridging, the core idea is that we can all be the Good Samaritan, that we don't have to be afraid of mental health crises, substance use crises when they emerge, or just somebody who's in mental health distress in our parish. We don't have to be afraid that we can cross the road just like the Good Samaritan, and we can help that person find the resources that they need. We don't have to be everything for them. You don't have to be their confessing father. You don't have to be their therapist. You just have to help them get up on their feet and help them and point them to the right resources. And that's what Peace of Mind training is. That information you can also find on the same website. another thing
and
that
this
we
is,
are
I
working
just want to
on.
clarify, Sangeeta, this is a program that has been launched by the Assembly that can come into churches to train their parishioners, their priests, and everybody to be able to kind of be that Good Samaritan, correct?
Absolutely, yes. So if you're interested in bringing that to your parish, you can actually email us at mentalhealth@assemblyofbishops.org, and we can set up a date. And we do a lot of the coordinating with you, and it's really just a matter of picking the right event package and the date and making sure there's lunch for everyone to enjoy. But we come to you, we train you, and we can train up to 30 people in a day and in one training experience. So this is a great training. We've trained about 140 since we launched. If I'm pulling that number off the top of my head, but I believe it's about 140. That's 50% clergy and 50% lay ministry leaders since we launched in 2022. So we're booking now already for this year, and occasionally we do put out promotional subsidies on our social media page. So that's an opportunity as well. This idea of community as we approach our time here is something that is now an active project of this ministry as we are working on developing a series of books called The Living Well. And we are hoping to address that middle ground, like Father Nick, you had mentioned in the introduction to the show, that you were approaching the space where mental health and pastoral care and theology all intersect. And that's what our book series aims to do, is to address how do we understand mental health? How do we approach the mind? How do we understand what care of the body and care of the soul looks like? What does that mean in action? How do we create a community that supports one another? So please do look out for that book series. It's meant to be something that can be used for small groups and OCF and everything in between. But that question that you just asked me of how do we do this in community, that's exactly what we're hoping to answer through the book.
I love that. I think that's so important. And, I think, as if there was just a word of encouragement that you would give our listeners, Sangeeta, as we are closing out our show, because I think that so many people are maybe listening to our show tonight, or maybe through a podcast or listening to it tonight, that are struggling with trauma. Maybe just a couple words that you can just encourage them with, because I know that so many of your clients obviously struggle with trauma. What would be that message to them?
That's a great question. I would say that you are not alone, and you don't have to stay where you're at right now. Whatever you're experiencing, there's a way through it, and you don't have to go through it alone. I have seen people pull through absolutely things that I could not even imagine doing to somebody, living through, and I don't know if I would personally be able to pull through. Somehow God's grace got them into my room and into a room of another trauma therapist. And I have seen people turn their lives around, and it is amazing to see that. So that type of change, that type of healing, that type of overcoming all of these hardships, being able to lay down your burdens as we're called to in scripture, like that is actually attainable. I've seen it. And I'm not even that seasoned of a therapist compared to Dr. Roxanne. And I'm sure she's seen it too, that like we have seen it, and we just want anybody who is experiencing this to know that there is a way through that darkness, and there is light on the other side. And I hope that you'll choose to walk that path.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Sangeeta, this was a gift to more than you know. There were so many comments and questions and emails we did not even get time to address. Love to have you back on the show at some point in the future to kind of do a part 2, if you'd be open to it.
Absolutely. I would be honored. Thank you so much for the time.
Well, once again, thank you, Sangeeta, for being with us. And we thank all of you for taking the time to be with us. Just as a reminder, in 3 weeks from today, on Tuesday, March 19th, we launch our newest book called 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, that chronicles the 6 hours that Christ was on the cross, and the 7 extraordinary statements he makes while he's on the cross. You can already pre-order it if you'd like to by going to our website, thelouhs.com. And you can also find out more by going to ancientfaith.com. There's a whole bunch of information about the new book coming out. It's a great Lenten resource as well. One
of those chapters being on the power of connection. So ironic that we talked so much about connection this evening. Absolutely.
And so we'd love for you to definitely explore it. Again, you can find out more on our website at thelouhs.com and register for our daily inspirational messages also on our website. Just simply go to the subscribe button and put in your email address. Once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Join us next Tuesday for a brand new Live with the Louhs show, everyone. God bless you all, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plant, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.